All right, we're about to go through our first little legal process and explain an interpretation of the law and how it resulted in rights. So we're going to deal with the process of incorporation. We're going to call this incorporation of civil liberties. This is going to explain how our individual rights are protected. So what we see in the background here, all sorts of people who ended up in court cases that allowed the Supreme Court to interpret the limits on our rights. So we'll end up talking about all of these folks over the next few days. But you up in the blue in the top left, you see Estelle Griswold. She is responsible for our right to privacy. In the purple is Dalry Mapp, who's responsible for a court case that expanded our protections from illegal searches. In the green, these are the Tinker siblings. They are responsible for some of your student protections for free speech. Down in the red at the bottom, that is Ernesto Miranda. You know him from the Miranda versus Arizona case. And over on the far right in the red, this is Mr. Otis McDonald, who is responsible for a court case that expanded protection for our right to own guns. All right, so first we've got to take a minute and look at just a small section of the 14th Amendment. So this is what we call the Due Process Clause. Remember, the 14th Amendment was written to give citizenship rights to people who had been enslaved by the slave states. So the abolition of slavery was not enough. The Constitution had to add protections for citizenship rights and to explain to those states how exactly they needed to treat their citizens. So part of that is explaining the due process rights here. And it says here, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So that includes, these are limits on state governments. It tells the state governments that they can't limit the privileges or immunities of anybody that's a citizen of the United States, that they can't take away the due process of anybody who's a citizen of the United States, and that they must treat each citizen of the United States equally. So that part in purple, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This is our 14th Amendment Due Process Clause. Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about the Fifth Amendment due process. Now, that protects you from the national government. The difference here in 14, nor shall any state. So this is a specific limit to make it clear that the state governments cannot take away your life, your liberty, or your property without due process of law. Now, this amendment, we know, was passed right after the Civil War, was intended to protect people who had been enslaved, and this is included to make sure that the states treat those people fairly. Now, this little phrase, here turns out to be one of the most important phrases in the entire Constitution. No state shall take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So let's take a look at how that changes interpretation of the Constitution. All right, it's time for a court case. Let's get right to it. Let's interpret some law. So we're going to go back to 1833. And our boy Barron, Mr. Barron, he's mad at the city of Baltimore. And so we'll look at whether or not he has a right and how the court ruled. So he's got a situation where he lives like on the, Baltimore is in the Chesapeake Bay. He lives there on like part of the coast. And the city they ended up like basically taking some of his property. They destroyed some of the value of his land. He couldn't farm on it anymore, all that kind of stuff. And he did not get compensated. So he's mad. That's why he's suing here. So let's think about those rights we were just going through. The government took his property and did not compensate him for that. So he feels like he's got a claim that the state has to compensate him since it took his property. Now, the Supreme Court, remember, their job is to interpret the law. They don't write the law. They don't change laws and all that kind of stuff. They have to interpret the law that is written. And so they read the words of the First Amendment. Now, this is a Fifth Amendment issue, but they are starting with the First Amendment because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law. And it goes on, Congress shall make no law that will respect an establishment of religion, nor shall they abridge your freedom of speech, nor shall they take away the freedom of the press, all this. So Congress won't do this, nor will they, nor will they, nor will they. So in this Barron versus Baltimore case, since the court is interpreting the meaning of the words, Congress will not do this, what they ruled is that the civil liberties in the Bill of Rights protect you from the actions of Congress. And that can mean the national government. So everything that's in the Bill of Rights, that protects you from the national government. But it does not necessarily protect you from the states. Right? So the words of the amendment are what matters. Congress won't do this. So by the eminent domain there, Congress won't take your property without compensating you fairly for that. In this case, Barron is pissed at the city of Baltimore. Baltimore took his property and didn't compensate him for that. The Supreme Court, using the words of the Constitution, says, "Oh, sorry, that sucks, but all the Constitution protects you from is Congress will not take your property." So what this really meant, first of all, it means that Barron is screwed. Barron doesn't get any compensation for his property, so he's going to be mad. But the important meaning for all of this for us is that the Bill of Rights only applies to the national government and not for the states. So this is the important precedent that the courts are going to follow for about 100 years. So Barron versus Baltimore resulted in Barron having his rights violated by the state. So we're going to fast forward about 100 years to 1925 and take a look at our most important court case of the day, Gitlow versus New York. So in Gitlow versus New York, we've got an issue where Gitlow has published a newspaper that people didn't like, and so he was punished by his state. So he thinks, of course he should have rights to free speech or free press, and he thinks that his rights are violated. But in the ruling, Barron versus Baltimore, remember the First Amendment would only protect Mr. Gitlow from the United States government. It would not protect him from the state of New York, and he's punished by the state of New York. But it's 1925, so how has the interpretation of the Constitution changed since what they decided in Barron versus Baltimore? So remember, Barron versus Baltimore, 1830, that is before the Civil War. Gitlow versus New York, this is way after the Civil War, so the 14th Amendment is there. And let's go back to that part of the 14th Amendment we were talking about, the Due Process Clause. It says, no state will take away your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. In Gitlow versus New York, this one phrase of the 14th Amendment changes the whole meaning of the First Amendment. Originally, the Supreme Court would look at the First Amendment and it says Congress will not make a law that takes away these rights. But now the 14th Amendment says no state can take away your liberty without due process. So the court says that the rights of freedom of speech and the rights of freedom of the press are fundamental personal rights, and those are protected from the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment protects you from letting the states trample on those rights in the Bill of Rights. So Gitlow versus New York, Gitlow wins, but the important thing here is it tells us that the 14th Amendment changes the meaning of Amendments 1 through 10. So this has created an important precedent. Remember, this is going to be an example that we follow in future cases. So now, if we're going to come across citizens who have their rights violated by the state governments before the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court would just say, sorry, the Bill of Rights only protects you from the national government and not the states. But with the 14th Amendment, remember this due process clause. No state can take away your liberty without due process. That means that now no state can take away your freedom of speech. No state can take away your freedom of the press. And that's what Gitlow is suing about here. So Gitlow is going to win this case. It's a First Amendment case, but it's because the 14th Amendment means that the First Amendment must be respected by the states. So this is a huge case, and this process is what we call selective incorporation. So our big idea today is what we call incorporation, and actually we're going to call this selective incorporation. So this is a legal reasoning process where we are applying the Bill of Rights to the state governments because of the due process clause in the 14th Amendment. So that one little sentence, no state can take away your liberty without due process, that changes the meaning of each part of the Bill of Rights. So it not only is going to protect you from the United States government, but it will also protect you from the state governments. We call it selective because this happens on a case-by-case basis. So Gitlow versus New York applied to the freedom of speech. It did not apply to the whole Bill of Rights. It didn't even apply to the whole First Amendment. It was just one part of the First Amendment. So this happens on a case-by-case basis. So like each part of the Bill of Rights is going to have to be sued. There's going to have to be a lawsuit about it separately. And we're going to go through a ton of lawsuits here. So each little part of the Bill of Rights is going to have to be looked at by the court. In fact, like 3 and 7 are not incorporated. We've never had a state infringe on those rights, and that's never come up in the Supreme Court. The Second Amendment right to bear arms was only incorporated in 2010 in a case called McDonald versus Chicago. So it has been a process that's been going on from 1925 to 2010. Each little piece of the Bill of Rights gets applied to the state government separately. So it's really, really important that you are able to define or describe this process. So one more time, we are using the due process clause of the 14th Amendment to apply parts of the Bill of Rights to state governments on a case-by-case basis. That's selective incorporation. And that's the big thing we've got to understand today before we begin to explore the different rights that we find in the Bill of Rights. All right, and that's it for today. Here is our fearless leader, President Trump. Got on some killer goggles, but refusing a mask. But time to take a look at our big ideas for today. We didn't go through a whole lot, but the two things we were talking about were pretty complicated. So we want to make sure we understand these things. And now we can move forward and talk about different parts of the Bill of Rights. So first of all, we want to make sure that we can define civil liberties. Remember, these are going to be limits on the national government. These are limits about what the national government cannot do to you. So your individual rights are protected because there are limits on the government's power. We need to be able to describe the civil liberties that we find in the Constitution and the ones in the Bill of Rights. So we'll have to go back to those old ones like habeas corpus and ex post facto laws and things like that, but also all the different provisions of the Bill of Rights from, freedom of speech, press, and religion all the way to, punishment, cruel and unusual punishment, and excessive bail. So we need to, over the course of the next few weeks, we will be able to thoroughly describe all these civil liberties. We need to be able to explain the reasons for the different rulings in Barron versus Baltimore and Gitlow versus New York. So we need to understand that Barron versus Baltimore took place before the 14th Amendment, and so the Bill of Rights only applies to the national government in those cases. And the precedents that would follow, they would say the Bill of Rights only applies to the national government. But Gitlow is suing after the 14th Amendment was added, and so he's got a new argument. He says, due process clause says they must give me my freedom of speech. So that's important to remember, that the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, no state will take away your liberty without due process. That's going to change the meaning of all of the Bill of Rights. All right, there we go. That's day one of law school. So day one of our Unit 3, our exploration into civil liberties and civil rights. We've talked about civil liberties today. We're about to go walking through all of the different parts of the Bill of Rights, going piece by piece, talking about what's okay, what's not okay, what limits the court has placed on these rights, and all of that. So we'll get into some interesting stories and talk about a whole bunch of different court cases, but we'll talk religion in the next couple days.